The railroad was their legacy. Their names were lost forever. The rock did not care how far a man had traveled to reach it. Wei stood on a narrow ledge barely wider than his boot, 500 feet above the American River, and drove an iron drill into granite with both hands. The sound rang out sharp and hollow across the gorge. Below him, the river was a thin silver thread. Above him, the Sierra Nevada climbed into low gray cloud. He did not look down. He had learned in his first week on the mountain that looking down was a choice you only made once. It was the winter of 1864, and the Central Pacific Railroad needed to cross a mountain range that most men in Sacramento believed could not be crossed by a railroad at all. The engineers had the maps and the calculations. The foremen had the schedules and the orders. And Charles Crocker, the large, loud man who ran construction from a horse and a wide-brimmed hat, had several thousand Chinese laborers who had come from Guangdong province in southern China, crossed the Pacific Ocean, and arrived in California with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the intention of sending money home. Wei was one of them. He was 24 years old. He had a mother in a village near the Pearl River Delta whose name he said every morning when he woke up, quietly, so no one else could hear. He had a younger brother who was going to use the money Wei sent home to buy a small boat for fishing. He had a way of tying a knot that no one else in his tent row could replicate, and his tent row had 11 men who had been watching him tie knots for 3 months. He did not have a name, as far as the Central Pacific Railroad was concerned. The company ledgers listed him as a number. The foreman called him by a shortened word that sounded nothing like his name, but was easier for an English-speaking man to say. When Wei had tried, on his first day, to correct the pronunciation, the foreman had looked at him, the way a man looks at a cart that has started making an unexpected sound, with mild irritation and no particular interest in understanding the cause. So Wei became a number in a ledger, a body on a cliff, a pair of hands holding a drill. What the ledger did not record was that those hands were extraordinary. The work on the Sierra Nevada was unlike anything the railroad had attempted before. The mountain did not have roads. It barely had paths. The western slopes were dense with pine and granite, and the eastern slopes dropped into the Nevada basin in long, brutal descents. The route the engineers had mapped required cutting shelves into cliff faces, drilling tunnels through solid rock, and building bridges over gorges that had never been bridged before. It was work that needed men who were careful, coordinated, and fearless in a very specific, quiet way. Not the loud fearlessness of men who believe nothing can hurt them, but the steady fearlessness of men who know exactly what can hurt them and have decided to proceed anyway. The Chinese workers had organized themselves long before Crocker figured out they were the best labor force he had ever seen. They came in crews, and each crew had its own internal structure, experienced men at the front, newer men learning behind them, older men managing the supplies and the cooking. They did not eat the food the railroad provided to white workers, which sat in barrels and made men ill within a week. They boiled water. They drank tea. They cooked rice and dried fish and vegetables that a small network of Chinese merchants delivered to the mountain camps on mule carts. In a workforce where sickness regularly halted progress, the Chinese crews stayed healthy at a rate that baffled the company doctors. They were also paid less. A white laborer on the Central Pacific earned $35 a month and received food and shelter from the company. Wei and the men around him earned $26 a month, bought their own food, and maintained their own camps. The math was not hidden. It was simply never discussed. The way a rule that benefits the person making it is often simply left unspoken. Wei did not spend much time thinking about the unfairness of the wage. He thought about it sometimes late at night, when the camp was quiet and the mountain made its low, grinding sounds that no one had ever been able to explain. But during the day, he thought about the rock. He thought about the angle of the drill and the weight behind each strike, and the way granite behaved differently depending on where the fault lines ran beneath the surface. He had become, Over 3 months of work, one of the best drillers in his crew. The crew leader, a compact older man named Liang who wore his hair in a long braid and had worked in the California gold mines before the railroad, had noticed. Liang never said anything directly, that was not his way, but he positioned Wei at the front of the hardest sections, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The baskets were Liang's idea, or at least Liang was the one who brought the technique to the foreman's attention. When the route reached Cape Horn, a sheer granite wall above the American River Gorge with no ledge wide enough to stand on, the engineers could not figure out how to get workers to the rock face. You could not build scaffolding on a vertical cliff. You could not blast from above without sending men to their deaths below. Liang told the foreman that in southern China, workers on stone buildings use suspended platforms woven from reeds. The foreman did not believe him. Liang made one and climbed into it over the gorge while the foreman watched from solid ground, gripping his hat in one hand. After that, the baskets were company policy. Wei spent 11 days in a basket above the American River. He and another man named Bo, who was from a village 3 miles from Wei's own and who had the habit of humming low songs while he worked, would be lowered down the cliff face each morning before the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline. They drilled holes into the rock. They packed the holes with black powder. They packed up their tools, signaled to the men above, and were hauled upward while the charge below them went off in a sound that Wei felt more in his chest than he heard with his ears. Then they went back down and cleared the broken rock and started again. Bo was hauled up 11 seconds too, late one morning in February. He survived. His left hand did not work the same way after that. Liang reassigned him to camp supply management, which was a kind thing to do, though no one called it kind. Bo continued to hum his low songs while he sorted provisions. Wei could hear him from the drilling site on days when the wind was quiet. The work moved forward. Every foot of granite removed was a foot of progress on a ledger somewhere in Sacramento. The men who moved it had no entry in that ledger beyond their wages. They had no names in the company records, no photographs, no accounts in any newspaper. When a correspondent from a San Francisco paper visited the camps that spring and wrote a piece about the progress on the Sierra Nevada, he described the Chinese workers as Crocker's pets and marveled at their industriousness with the tone of a man describing an interesting species of ant. He did not speak to any of them. He could not have, because none of his editors would have printed their words even if he had written them down. The mountain did not care about any of this. The mountain had been where it was for several million years and would continue to be where it was long after the railroad and the newspaper and Charles Crocker and Wei himself were all equally gone. The granite simply resisted, the way granite does, and the men pushed back against it, the way men do when they have no other option and something on the other side is worth reaching. What was on the other side for Wei was the money going home, the boat his brother would buy, the mother who would stop worrying. What was on the other side for the Central Pacific Railroad was the Pacific Coast linked to the rest of the country, the government land grants, the per-mile construction subsidies, and the commercial supremacy of a continent crossed by iron and steam. Both of these things were true at the same time, which is how history usually works. Two entirely different stories happening inside the same moment, one of them recorded and one of them not. The summit of the Sierra Nevada was still far above them in the spring of 1864. The hardest work, the tunnels, the blizzards, the nitroglycerin, was still ahead. Wei drove his drill into the rock each morning and listened to it ring, and the mountain absorbed the sound the way it absorbed everything else, without complaint and without memory. The river kept moving far below. The clouds moved across the peaks. The campfires went out each night and were started again each morning, and the men who started them had names they used with each other in Cantonese in the dark, names that were warm and specific and entirely their own, names that not a single company ledger would ever hold. The nitroglycerin arrived in unmarked crates, and nobody said the word out loud when new workers were nearby. It was the spring of 1865, and the Central Pacific had a problem that black powder alone could not solve. The Summit Tunnel, the longest tunnel in the route, 1,659 feet through the hardest granite in the Sierra Nevada, was going too slowly. They were moving 7 inches a day. At that rate, the railroad would not reach the Nevada state line before the decade ended. The Union Pacific, building west from Omaha, was already hundreds of miles ahead on flat prairie. Congress had tied the railroad's government payments to the miles of track laid, and the men who owned the Central Pacific were running out of patience in a way that expressed itself as pressure on Crocker, which expressed itself as pressure on the foremen, which settled eventually on the backs of the workers like a second gravity. The engineers proposed nitroglycerin. It had been used in mining with inconsistent results, which was a gentle way of saying that it had also been used in mining with catastrophic results. Unlike black powder, which burned at a controlled rate when ignited, nitroglycerin detonated from shock. Drop a crate. Jostle it too hard on a mule cart over rocky ground. Let it warm too unevenly in the sun. The result was not an explosion in the way most people imagined, not a boom and a flash, but an event so immediate and total that men who had been standing nearby were simply no longer standing anywhere. There was no moment between before and after. There was only after. A man called George, who was one of the white powder supervisors, explained this to the Chinese work crews without apparent awareness that he was describing the deaths of men who looked very much like the men he was speaking to. George was not an unkind man. He was simply a man who had learned to categorize certain risks as belonging to the work and not to the people doing the work, which made it easier to keep doing the work. The crew leader who translated for Wei's section was Liang, and Liang translated everything George said with a face that gave nothing away. Wei watched Liang the way he always watched him during these briefings, looking for the small adjustments in Liang's posture that meant the news was worse than the words. When Liang finished translating, his posture said the news was exactly as bad as the words. Wei became a powder man by default. He was not chosen for courage, exactly. He was chosen because he had the hands for it, precise and steady, and because Liang trusted him to follow instructions exactly once and then trust his own judgment after that, which was the only quality that actually mattered when handling something that punished improvisation. There were 7 powder men in his crew. By the end of the summer of 1866, there were 4. The Summit Tunnel was worked from both ends and from 2 shafts sunk into the mountain from above. The crews inside the tunnel worked by candlelight. The air was thick with dust and the smell of burnt powder, and underneath both of those, the particular cold smell of rock that had never seen daylight. Wei worked the central heading, the leading edge of the tunnel face, where progress was measured in inches per day, and every inch came from the same sequence: drill, charge, clear, repeat. He learned the weight of a charge the way a musician learns a note, not by thinking about it, but by doing it so many times that the knowledge moved out of the mind and into the fingers. He learned how nitroglycerin felt when it was stable and how it felt when it was not, which was a distinction that he could not explain to anyone who had not worked with it, but which was as real to him as the difference between a rope that would hold and one that would not. He drilled the holes to a specific depth. He packed the charge to a specific weight. He set the fuse and moved at a pace that was not slow. He was not careless, but was also not running, because running in a tunnel with a low ceiling and uneven footing in the dark was how men got hurt in ways that had nothing to do with explosives. The technique improved. The tunnel began moving faster. By late 1865, they were making 2 feet a day. Crocker was satisfied in the way men who want 3 feet a day are satisfied with 2. Outside the tunnel, winter arrived with a force that no one in the Sacramento offices had planned for. The winter of 1865 into 1866 was one of the worst in Sierra Nevada memory. Snow began falling in October and did not stop. By December, the drifts at the summit were 40 feet deep. Supply wagons could not reach the camps. The route was buried under so much snow that the surface of the mountain looked continuous and smooth, hiding the gullies and ridgelines beneath. The work did not stop. Crocker ordered it to continue, and so it continued. The Chinese workers built a city under the snow. They dug down through the drifts to the rock surface and then continued digging horizontally, creating tunnels that connected their sleeping quarters to the tunnel worksite and to the supply areas and to the cooking stations. They lived underground. They slept underground. They woke each morning in the blue-white half-light that filtered down through the snow above them and walked through their underground corridors to the underground face of the tunnel they were building through the mountain, which meant they were, for much of that winter, tunneling inside tunneling. Wei sometimes thought about this arrangement as he worked. He had grown up near open water. He had never spent a winter in snow at all before coming to California. Now he spent his winters in a world where there was no sky, only rock below, snow above, and a small corridor of candlelight between. He tried not to think about the weight of the snow over his head. Instead, he counted the strikes of his drill. He counted because counting was a form of moving forward, and moving forward was the only response he had to places that felt like they were closing in. The men in his tent section knew each other the way people know each other when they have been confined in a small space through a long emergency. They knew who snored and who muttered in his sleep, and who woke up first in the morning, and who was the last one willing to admit that the candle needed to be relit. They knew each other's moods in the particular fine-grained way that comes from sharing walls that are made of snow. A man named Ren, who slept 2 positions to Wei's left, and had a habit of drawing small maps of his home village on any flat surface he could find, rock, snow, the back of his own hand, had a younger sister who was supposed to be married in the spring. Ren had not been home in 2 years. He talked about the sister's wedding in a way that made it sound very close, the way men talk about things they are afraid will happen without them. The avalanches began in January. They came without warning, which is how avalanches work, and without preference for who was in their path, which is also how avalanches work. The first one took 3 sleeping quarters on the eastern side of the camp and moved them down the slope in a sound that the men in the tunnel described afterward as the mountain clearing its throat. Search crews dug for 2 days. They found everyone. Some of them were found in spring when the snow retreated, still in the positions they had been in when the avalanche reached them. The company did not record the names of men lost to avalanches in these months. The records show gaps in payroll weeks where a number simply stops appearing. A gap in a payroll ledger is a very small thing. It fits easily between 2 other numbers. It does not take up much space. Ren's name disappeared from the payroll in March of 1866. Wei was in the tunnel when it happened and only learned about it when he came out and found the eastern sleeping quarters half collapsed and the camp very quiet. He sat for a while near where the quarters had been. He did not cry, which was not because he did not feel anything, but because the feeling was too large and too cold to come out that way. He sat until Liang came and touched him once on the shoulder and then went back to the tunnel entrance, and Wei got up and followed him. The tunnel breakthrough happened in August 1867. Both headings met in the middle, and when the last wall of rock came down, the men on either side could see each other's candles through the dust. There was a shout from the eastern heading. The western heading shouted back. No correspondent recorded the moment. No photograph was taken. The payroll ledger noted that the week's drilling quota had been met. On the other side of the mountain, the Nevada Basin stretched out flat and brown and enormous, and the railroad needed to cross it next, and the men who had just crossed the Sierra Nevada picked up their tools and began. Nobody needed to announce that the breaking point had arrived, because everyone already knew. It was June of 1867, and approximately 2,000 Chinese workers on the Central Pacific Railroad stopped work at the same moment, on the same morning, across the summit camps and the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada. They put down their drills and their shovels and their blasting equipment. They walked back to their camps and they stayed there, and the mountain was quiet in a way it had not been in 3 years. It was the largest organized work action in the American West to that point in history. No newspaper would call it a strike. The action had been planned across several weeks in the quiet hours after work, in conversations that moved between crews through a network of shared meals and translated messages, and the particular kind of careful communication that happens when men know the wrong word in the wrong ear will end everything before it begins. The leader of the central planning was not a foreman or an official. He was a man named Eli, not his Chinese name, which nobody outside his home province could say correctly, but the name a missionary schoolteacher in Guangdong had given him years earlier, which had stuck the way unexpected names sometimes do. Eli was 31 years old, had been on the railroad for 2 years, and had a mind that could hold a large number of connected ideas at the same time without losing track of any of them. Eli had written the demands on a single piece of paper in Chinese characters, and the paper had been copied by hand 7 times and passed between the crew leaders over the course of 4 days. The demands were 3. First, equal wages. White workers earned $35 a month. Chinese workers earned $26. The difference was not based on any measure of skill or output. Chinese crews consistently drilled faster, moved more rock, and lost fewer workdays to illness than their white counterparts. The difference was based on the fact that one group of men could be paid less, and so they were. Second, shorter hours. Above-ground crews worked 11 hours a day. Below-ground crews in the tunnels worked 10. Eli's demand was 10 hours above ground and 8 below, which matched the hours demanded by the Working Men's Union in San Francisco for indoor laborers. Third, an end to the company's practice of using punishment, the withholding of wages, the forced extension of contracts, to control workers' movements and choices. None of these demands were unreasonable. All of them were refused before they were even formally presented. Charles Crocker heard about the action on the morning it began and rode out to the summit camps by mid-afternoon. He was a large man with a temper that he wore openly, like a coat, and he had built a reputation on the railroad for getting what he wanted through the sheer pressure of his presence. He had also, over 3 years of construction, come to understand that the Chinese workers were not afraid of him, the way that understanding was supposed to work. They were not indifferent to him, exactly. They simply had a different calculation of what mattered and what didn't, and Crocker's temper was near the bottom of that list. He offered nothing. He stood in front of a gathering of several hundred workers and their translators, and told them, through an interpreter, that their demands were excessive, that the wages they received were already generous for the work being done, and that any man who did not return to work by the following morning would be replaced. Eli, standing at the back of the group, listened to the translation and then spoke quietly to the man beside him, who passed the words along the row. The message was, tomorrow they would still not be working. Wei was not one of the planners. He had known the action was coming for about a week, the way everyone in the camps had known, through the particular quality of the conversations around the evening fires, more deliberate than usual, more careful. When the morning came and Liang walked through the sleeping quarters and said simply, "Not today," Wei understood immediately and got up and followed the others back to camp without question. He was not sure the action would succeed. He was not sure it would fail. He had spent enough time on the mountain to know that certainty was a luxury that the Sierra Nevada stripped away from men very efficiently. What he was sure of was that the demand was right. $26 against $35 for the same hours in the same conditions on the same mountain was not a difference anyone could justify with a straight face, and Wei had been watching people try to justify it with a straight face for 2 years, and he was tired of watching it. The first 3 days of the action were quiet. The camps functioned normally, meals were cooked, supplies were organized, the underground corridors were kept clear. Men talked more than usual. The particular social energy of men who have stopped doing one thing and not yet started another thing filled the camp with a quality of attentiveness that Wei found, unexpectedly, almost pleasant. People told stories. Old arguments were finished. New ones began and were resolved. It was during these days that Wei learned things about the men around him that 3 years of shared work had not provided. A man named Dai, who had drilled beside Wei for most of the summit tunnel, and with whom Wei had exchanged perhaps 40 words in total, turned out to have been a teacher of calligraphy in his home city before the money ran out and the railroad recruiters arrived. He spent the first afternoon of the action drawing characters in the dirt with a stick, and when Wei sat down beside him and watched, Dai began explaining what each one meant, not in the way a teacher explains to a student, but in the way a man explains something he loves to someone who happens to be nearby and willing to listen. Another man, older, named Fang, had a story about crossing the Pacific that he had apparently been holding onto for 4 years, because no one had ever been still enough to hear it. He told it on the second evening of the action over a long meal, and the men around him were quieter than Wei had ever heard a group of men be. The action lasted 7 days. On the 6th day, Crocker cut the food supply. Not the Chinese workers' food supply. The men had always purchased and prepared their own food, but the supply chains. He contacted the Chinese merchant networks that ran mule carts to the mountain camps and told them that any merchant who continued to supply the striking workers would lose the company contracts that formed the backbone of their businesses. It was a precise and calculated pressure, aimed not at the workers directly, but at the network that connected them to the resources they needed. By the morning of the 7th day, the food in the camps was running low. Not empty, not yet, but the direction was clear, and everyone in the camps could read it. Eli called a meeting of the crew leaders. Wei was not in that meeting, but he could see it from where he was sitting. A group of men seated in a rough circle near the supply tent, speaking in low, even voices, their faces composed in the careful way of people who are making a decision they know is going to cost something no matter which way it goes. The meeting lasted about 2 hours. When Liang walked back through the sleeping quarters that evening, his face said what his words had not yet said. Wei got up when Liang stopped at his section. He did not ask. He already knew. They returned to work the following morning. The company records noted the work stoppage as a labor disruption caused by agitation among the Chinese workers, resolved when the workers were persuaded to return by their own crew leaders. The word that was never used was strike. A strike implies people with rights exercising those rights. The grammar of the company's language did not include that construction for this group of men. The wages remained at $26. The hours remained unchanged. The movement restrictions remained in place. What changed was harder to measure and was not recorded in any document. The men who had spent 7 days sitting together, telling each other stories, drawing characters in the dirt, listening to an old man describe the Pacific crossing in words that had waited 4 years, those men went back to work knowing something about each other that could not be put in a ledger. They knew each other's names. They had used them over those 7 days with a frequency and ease that the pace of work never allowed. On the mountain, they were numbers. In the camp for that 1 week, they had been exactly who they were. Eli kept working. He drilled and blasted and cleared and moved forward with the rest of them, and the railroad kept gaining miles, and the company kept gaining money, and the demands were gone from the record as though they had never been made. But they had been made. Every man who had been there knew they had been made. And knowing a thing, even when no document confirms it, is a form of keeping it alive that no ledger can reach. The golden spike was polished before it was driven, which seemed right for a thing that was meant to be remembered. It was the 10th of May, 1869, At a flat, windswept place in northern Utah called Promontory Summit, two railroad locomotives faced each other from opposite ends of a joined track. The Central Pacific had come from the west. The Union Pacific had come from the east. Together, in the 6 years since construction had begun, they had crossed a continent. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, held a silver hammer. The spike, genuinely gold, though softer than iron and never intended to bear actual weight, had been polished to a brightness that caught the thin Utah morning light. A telegraph wire was connected to the spike and to the hammer, so that the moment of contact would send a signal across the country simultaneously. In San Francisco, they were preparing to ring the bells of Mission Dolors. In Washington, the news would arrive at the White House within seconds. Andrew Russell, a photographer employed by the Union Pacific, set up his equipment and waited for the best light. The ceremony drew a crowd of several hundred people: railroad officials, military officers, construction supervisors, dignitaries who had traveled from Sacramento and from Omaha, journalists, local observers, and the assorted collection of workers, laborers, and support staff that large events naturally gathered. It was a genuinely significant moment. The Transcontinental Railroad was, by most measurements of the era, the largest engineering achievement in American history to that point. The speeches were long and earnest and occasionally moving, though the wind at Promontory Summit made it difficult to hear everything, and some of the more eloquent passages were lost to the crowd at the back. When Russell took his photograph, the frame was full. The two locomotives stood at either end. Between and around them stood a dense gathering of men in various hats and coats. The mood in the photograph is unmistakable. It is the mood of men who believe they have done something permanent and are pleased about it. Hands are raised. Bottles appear to be present. Someone near the center of the frame is reaching forward, perhaps to shake another hand. Every person visible in the frame was white. The Chinese workers who had laid the rails, who had blasted the tunnels, who had hung in baskets above the American River and tunneled through 40 feet of Sierra Nevada snow, and survived nitroglycerin and avalanche, and a strike that the company had refused to call a strike. Those men were not in the frame. Some accounts, written later, suggest the Chinese workers had already broken camp before the ceremony began. Some suggest they were present but standing behind the photographer's position, which would have placed them outside any frame regardless of how the shot was composed. Some suggest the question of where they were was simply never asked by anyone who was taking notes that day. The historical record is consistent in this way. The question of where the Chinese workers were at the moment of the ceremony is answered, across all available sources, with the same word: elsewhere. Wei had been at Promontory Summit since early April. His crew had been working the final connections, the last miles of grading and track laying, as the two lines approached each other across the Utah Flats. The terrain was easier than anything in the Sierra Nevada. It was almost strange to work on flat ground. His body had adjusted so completely to slopes and ledges and uneven surfaces that walking on level earth felt, for the first week, slightly wrong. He had watched the junction point close from both sides. It was one of the stranger things he had experienced on the railroad, the feeling of approaching an end, of working towards something that had a specific, visible location. In the mountains, progress was abstract. You moved through rock. You could not see the other side until you were almost at it. Here, you could see the other side from miles away. The Union Pacific camps were visible to the east, growing larger each day as the gap narrowed. Wei had spent a morning watching, from a slight rise near the grading site, as the two sets of workers came close enough that individuals became distinguishable. Not names, not faces, but figures, human-scale people. They were the same distance apart in May as they had been in April, in the ways that mattered. On the morning of the ceremony, Liang's crew worked until mid-morning on maintenance tasks, and then was given, informally, the afternoon without assignment. The foreman relayed this through a translator without particular enthusiasm, as though he had been told to say it rather than decided it himself. The men ate and then sat in the camp, which was far enough from the main ceremony area that the speeches were inaudible, and only the occasional distant shout of a crowd reached them. Wei could see the tops of the two locomotives from where he sat. He could see the flags. He could hear, eventually, the sound of the crowd at the moment of the spike, not the hammer blow itself, which was too small and too far, but the sound of many people responding to it at once, a wave of noise that rose and fell and then broke into something that might have been cheering. He sat with that sound for a moment. He thought of the Summit Tunnel, which was now a permanent passage through the Sierra Nevada that trains would use for generations. He thought of the Cape Horn Ledge, now a shelf of blasted granite that carried the rail around the gorge. He thought of Wren's maps drawn on the back of his hand, the small diagrams of a village that no longer needed to be remembered that way because Wren himself would have carried it home, if Wren had gone home. He thought of Bo, who hummed low songs and whose left hand no longer worked the same way. None of these men were in the frame. The ceremony ended. The trains sounded their whistles, which Wei could hear clearly from the camp, two long notes that overlapped and then separated, each going in its own direction. Stanford and the other officials boarded the Central Pacific train and headed back toward Sacramento. The crowd dispersed in the way crowds do, in small groups and then smaller groups until the flat ground at Promontory Summit was mostly empty. Wei's crew was not given passage on the train going back. They were told, through the translator, that the formal work of the railroad was complete and that the company would settle remaining wages within the standard period. The means of getting home, Sacramento, San Francisco, or wherever home would need to be arranged by the men themselves. The railroad had no further obligation in that direction. The walk back was long. Some men found space on wagons heading west along the supply route. Some attached themselves to groups of workers moving toward the Nevada settlements where the mining camps offered at least temporary labor. Some men simply walked. Wei walked for 2 days before joining a group moving toward Sacramento on a borrowed wagon. The Nevada desert in May was nothing like the Sierra Nevada. It was open and pale and made everything that moved across it feel very small. The sky was the largest sky Wei had ever seen, larger than the sky over the Pacific somehow, because there was nothing on any side to suggest an edge. He thought during those 2 days about the photograph. He had heard, through the translator before he left Promontory, that a photograph had been taken at the ceremony. He had heard this the way he heard most news about the official proceedings of the railroad, as information about a world that was happening nearby, but not to him. He wondered briefly what was in it. Then he decided it did not matter very much, because he already knew, and because a photograph could only hold what the photographer chose to include, and the choosing had been done by men whose choices he had been watching for 5 years. The railroad was real. He had built it. He had stood on ledges above rivers and in the dark center of mountains and on the flat edge of an American desert, and he had built it with his hands, which were still his hands, still precise and steady, still capable of the particular fine judgment that made a powder charge safe or dangerous, still able to tie a knot that no one else in a camp could replicate. The photograph would say what it said. The ledger would say what it said. Neither of them was the whole story. What was the whole story was the mountain, which still stood, and the tunnel through it, which did not collapse in spring or summer or in the decades and generations that followed, because the men who built it had built it correctly, and the shelf at Cape Horn, still visible from the river below, a stripe of human work cut into the face of granite that had stood for millions of years. Those things were not in the photograph either. But they were there. The archive smelled of old paper and something else, something mineral and faint, like the inside of a stone building on a cold day. Alina sat at a narrow table in the reading room of a county record's office in Sacramento and turned the pages of a payroll ledger from 1866 with the particular care of someone who understood that the paper was fragile and also that what it contained was fragile in a completely different way. The ledger was thin. Most of its entries were numbers. Column after column of wage amounts, dates, crew designations, and in the column where names appeared for the white workers and foremen, the Chinese workers had a notation system that translated roughly as crew number and position. Crew 7, position 4. Crew 12, position 9. On and on for pages. Alina was a historian at the University of California, and she had been working on the question of Chinese railroad workers for 11 years. She had started because a colleague had pointed her toward a gap, not a mystery exactly, but an absence so large and so consistent that it had the shape of something deliberate. Tens of thousands of men had built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad. Their labor was documented in engineering reports, in progress summaries, in Charles Crocker's letters, in the testimony of the railroad's executives before Congress. Their wages were in the ledgers. Their output, the tunnel footage, the track miles, the blasted footage of granite, was in the official records in precise and careful detail. Their names were almost entirely absent. The Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project, which Alina was part of, had been working since 2012 to recover what could be recovered. Historians, archivists, and researchers in California, Nevada, Utah, and Guangdong Province in southern China were going through every available source: ship manifests, county birth and death records, church registers, census records, immigration papers, and family histories held by descendants who sometimes did not know their great-great-grandfather had built anything famous at all. The work was slow. The sources were incomplete. The gaps were sometimes so wide that a researcher could spend a month following a thread and arrive at a blank space with nothing on the other side. Alina was following a name, partial, possible, unconfirmed, that had appeared in a ship manifest from Hong Kong to San Francisco in 1862. A man traveling with 3 other men from the same county in Guangdong. The manifest listed their names in the phonetic English approximations that immigration clerks used, which bore only a rough relationship to the Cantonese originals. One of the 4 names had shown up, possibly, in a church charity register from Sacramento in 1870, suggesting the man had been in Sacramento at some point after the railroad's completion. And one of the crew designations in the 1866 payroll ledger matched, in its geographic coding, the county in Guangdong Province that the ship manifest listed as the men's origin. These were thin threads. Alina knew they were thin. 11 years of this work had given her a precise sense of the difference between a recoverable name and a hope, and this was somewhere between the two, closer to a hope, probably, but not entirely without substance. She turned to the next page of the ledger and found the entry she had been looking for: Crew 7, Position 4, wages recorded through November of 1866, and then a gap. The gap lasted 3 months and then resumed, which usually indicated injury or illness. The gap in this case coincided with the worst of the Summit Tunnel winter. She sat with the gap for a moment. She had sat with many gaps over 11 years. Each one was a person, and each person was a door she could not open. Some of them she had managed, through years of cross-referencing, to assign a probable name to. A name that came with the appropriate asterisk of historical uncertainty. Possibly, likely, probably, but still a name, still something a descendant could hold and say, "This is who he was." She looked at the gap in the ledger. She looked at the column where a name should have been. Across town, in a house that had been in the same family for 4 generations, a man named Philip sat with his grandmother on a Sunday afternoon and listened to her talk about her grandfather's grandfather, which was a thing she did sometimes in the way old people return to certain subjects that have never fully resolved themselves. Philip was 28 and worked in software, and had grown up in Sacramento, and had, until recently, known very little about his family's history before his great-grandparents' generation. His grandmother was 83 years old and had been born in the Central Valley, and spoke Cantonese to herself when she was thinking hard about something and English to everyone else. She had a photograph on the wall of the hallway, not of anyone they knew, but of a section of the Sierra Nevada taken from the American River below, sometime in the early 20th century, that showed a narrow shelf of blasted granite running along the cliff face above the gorge. She had always called it the wall that carries the trains. Philip had asked her once where she got the photograph. She had said her mother's mother had it, and her mother's mother had gotten it from someone who had worked on the railroad, and that person's name had been lost somewhere along the way names get lost when families move a lot and paperwork doesn't travel with them. The shelf in the photograph was Cape Horn. Philip did not know this. His grandmother did not know the name, though she knew the place was somewhere above the American River. Neither of them had connected the photograph to the Transcontinental Railroad in any specific way. It was simply the wall that carries the trains, a family image with a broken chain of explanation. Elsewhere, in a village in Guangdong province that had sent more than 300 men to the California Railroad between 1862 and 1869, a local historian named May was going through a set of family papers that had been donated to the village archive by a family clearing out a house. The papers were a mix of personal letters, household accounts, and a small cloth-wrapped bundle of documents in the inside pocket of a coat that had not been worn in, at a guess, 140 years. The documents in the coat included a letter written in careful Cantonese characters, faded but legible, addressed to a woman in the village. The letter described the mountains in California. It described the cold. It described the sound the tunnel made when the rock came down, and the two headings met in the middle. It described, in a single short sentence that seemed to have been written quickly and then not added to, the week when they had stopped working and what it had cost and what it had not bought. The letter was signed with a name. May photographed every page of the letter and uploaded it to the project database. The name at the bottom went into the database with a flag indicating it was a first-person primary source, the rarest and most valuable category. Alina received the database flag 3 days later as an email notification on a Thursday morning. She opened it at her desk with a cup of tea and read the transcription, and then read it again. She checked the name against the ship manifest she had been working from. It was not an exact match. The phonetic rendering from the immigration clerk was approximate, as they always were. But the county of origin in Guangdong matched. The approximate year of departure matched. The geographic coding and the crew designation matched. The thread had not broken. It was still thin, still properly flagged as probable rather than confirmed. But it was there. She opened her records file and looked at the entry she had been building for Crew 7, Position 4, for the past 4 months. She looked at the gap in the 1866 payroll ledger. She looked at the name from the letter in Guangdong. She typed the name into the record. Then she added the notation that the field required: probable identification, cross-reference sources, confidence level moderate. She looked at what she had written for a long moment. In the hallway of a house in Sacramento, the photograph of the shelf above the American River hung in the same place it had hung for as long as anyone in the family could remember. Philip walked past it on his way out of the house that Sunday afternoon, the way he always did. He paused this time, which he did not always do. He looked at the narrow stripe of blasted granite on the cliff face, the work of hands that had carried something forward without being able to name what it was they were carrying. His grandmother was still in the living room. He thought about going back to ask her something about the photograph, about the name that had been lost, about the person who had sent it. He stood in the hallway for a moment between the door and the photograph, undecided. In the archive in Sacramento, Alina was still looking at the name she had typed. The record was not closed. Records like this are never fully closed, because the evidence is always partial, and the honest thing to do with partial evidence is to hold it carefully and mark what you do not know. But the name was there now where the gap had been. Not confirmed, not complete, but there in the record in the space where nothing had been. Outside the archive, Sacramento went on in the way cities go on, full of movement, full of people who did not know each other's names, full of roads and bridges and buildings whose foundations had been laid by people who were also not in any photograph. The railroad still ran through the Sierra Nevada. It still crossed the Cape Horn Shelf. It still passed through the Summit Tunnel, which had been widened and reinforced over the decades, but still occupied the original path through the granite that the men of 1865 and 1866 had cut, inch by inch, charge by charge, in candlelight and cold. Trains passed through it every week. The passengers looked at their phones. They looked out the window at the mountains. They did not know they were inside something that had been built by hands whose names had almost entirely been lost. Almost. Alina closed the file. She would come back to it. She always came back. That was the work, returning again and again to the place where a name should be and staying there until something came through. Outside, the morning was still going. The archive was quiet. The paper in the ledger was old and fragile and still held every number it had always held. The numbers had never been the whole story. They had only been what was written down.